The neighborhood looked like a postcard the city used to sell safety. Wide streets, neatly trimmed lawns, porch lights glowing softly as evening settled in. A place where nothing bad was supposed to happen, at least not to them. That's when the scream cut through the calm. "He's breaking in, I see him. Someone call the police." Windows flew open, doors cracked, curtains twitched like nervous eyes. On the sidewalk stood a black man in a dark jacket, keys in his hand, pausing mid-step as the word burglar echoed from across the street. Karen Whitmore clutched her phone from her front porch, heart racing, voice shaking, not with fear alone, but certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from believing you already know the ending. "He doesn't live here," she told the dispatcher. "I've never seen him before. He's been lurking for weeks." Across the street, the man slowly turned, his face unreadable. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He simply stood there as blue and red lights began to spill across white fences and manicured hedges. Neighbors gathered like spectators to a story they thought they understood. Some whispered, some recorded, some nodded along as if this accusation made sense the moment they saw his skin. The man raised his hands calmly, even before the police arrived. That was the part no one questioned. The officers stepped out fast, commands were shouted, hands hovered near holsters. The quiet street now buzzed with tension thick enough to taste. Karen felt justified, proud even. This was what responsible people did: protect their community. What she didn't see was the way the man's jaw tightened, not in panic but recognition. He had been here before. Not this street, not these houses. But this moment. Being judged before he spoke, treated like a threat before being seen as human. As an officer reached for his cuffs, the man finally spoke, steady, low, controlled. "I need you to slow down." The words barely carried over the sirens. Karen scoffed. "You see, he's resisting." But the man wasn't resisting. He was waiting. Waiting for the right second. Waiting for the truth to arrive. Because what none of them knew, not the neighbors, not the officers, not the woman who made the call, was that the man they had surrounded, the man they called a burglar, was the one sent to hunt criminals. And what happened next would change everything. Before that night, Elias Monroe had already learned how to disappear in plain sight. Every morning he left his house before sunrise, locking the door with quiet precision. No music, no lingering, just a man moving with purpose through a neighborhood that never quite knew what to make of him. He waved when spoken to, nodded when ignored, never stayed long enough in one place to invite questions, even though questions followed him anyway. To the neighbors, Elias was an unknown variable. A black man in his early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, always composed. He dressed simply: dark jeans, neutral jackets, boots that looked worn but deliberate. No flashy car, no visible family, no explanation. And in a neighborhood where sameness passed for safety, that made him stand out more than anything loud ever could. Inside his house, everything was orderly, sparse. A place that looked lived in but not settled. A suitcase sat half unpacked in the closet, documents locked away. His phone never left his reach. On some nights he stood at the window longer than necessary, watching the street the way a guard watches a gate. Elias carried an old wound, one that didn't bleed anymore but still ached. He had spent most of his life proving he was not what people assumed, that he was more than the fear he triggered just by existing, more than the stories people told themselves the moment they saw him walking toward them on an empty street. He didn't complain about it. He adjusted. Across the street lived Karen Whitmore, and Karen noticed everything. At least she believed she did. She had moved into the neighborhood 5 years earlier and quickly made herself indispensable. HOA meetings, community watch emails, door-to-door reminders about trash bins and parking rules. She framed her vigilance as care, as responsibility. "This is a family neighborhood," she liked to say. "We look out for each other." But what she really meant was control. Karen noticed Elias the day he moved in, not because he was loud or disruptive, but because he didn't fit the picture in her head. She couldn't place him, didn't know where he worked, didn't see visitors, didn't understand his hours. Uncertainty made her uncomfortable, and discomfort, left unchecked, curdled into suspicion. She watched him from behind blinds as he unloaded boxes, watched him when he came home late, watched him when he spoke politely to neighbors who barely met his eyes. Each observation stacked on the last until she had built a story that felt real enough to justify her unease. He's always watching, she told herself. What she didn't consider was that he was being watched, too. Not everyone looked at Elias with fear. Mrs. Evelyn Carter had lived on that street longer than anyone else, long enough to remember when the trees were saplings and the sidewalks cracked with age instead of pressure washers. She had seen neighborhoods change, people come and go, and patterns repeat themselves with different faces. She noticed how Elias fixed her loose fence without being asked, how he carried her groceries when her arthritis flared, how he always said ma'am and meant it. She also noticed how people crossed the street when he walked toward them. Mrs. Carter knew that look. She'd worn it herself once, the quiet knowledge that no matter how gentle you are, some people will only ever see what they've been taught to fear. The neighborhood itself was a character in the story, clean, quiet, and deeply convinced of its own innocence. A place where lawns mattered more than listening, where safety meant familiarity, and familiarity meant sameness. Police cruisers rolled through often, not because crime was common, but because presence felt reassuring. It was a performance of order, one that worked until it didn't. Elias knew the irony of it all. By day, he blended into the background as much as possible. By night, he studied patterns, movements, inconsistencies. His work demanded patience, restraint, and silence. He was used to carrying authority without displaying it, used to letting people underestimate him. That was part of the job. But even he underestimated how quickly suspicion could harden into accusation when fed by fear and entitlement. Karen felt like the neighborhood was slipping out of her grasp. New faces, new energy, too many unknowns, and Elias, quiet, unreadable Elias, became the symbol of everything she couldn't control. She didn't hate him. She feared what she didn't understand. And fear, when given a badge of righteousness, can become dangerous. As the days passed, tension settled into the cracks of the street. Nothing had happened yet, but something was coming. It lingered in the air, heavy and patient. Elias felt it. Mrs. Carter sensed it. Karen prepared for it. And the neighborhood, convinced of its own goodness, stood unknowingly on the edge of a moment that would force everyone to confront who they really were, and who they were willing to become when fear knocked at their door. The night it happened did not announce itself as important. It arrived the way most dangerous moments do, quietly, disguised as routine. Elias Monroe pulled into the neighborhood just after dusk, the sky still holding onto a thin ribbon of orange along the horizon. He parked his car in the driveway, sat for a second longer than usual, and scanned the street. Porch lights were coming on one by one. A couple across the road argued softly over groceries. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked and then stopped. Everything looked normal, but Elias felt the shift anyway. He stepped out of the car, adjusted the strap of his bag over his shoulder, and closed the door with a controlled, deliberate motion. The bag wasn't heavy, but he treated it like it mattered, because it did. Inside were documents he never left unattended, tools of a job no one around him knew he held. As he walked toward his front door, he sensed movement from across the street, a silhouette behind glass, still, watching. He didn't look up. Years of experience had taught him that eye contact could turn curiosity into confrontation, faster than words ever could. The lock clicked as he slid his key in. For a brief second, everything paused, like the street itself was holding its breath. Then the voice shattered it. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Elias froze, hand still on the doorknob. The voice wasn't panicked, it wasn't confused, it was sharp, accusatory, certain. He turned slowly. Karen Whitmore stood halfway down her front steps, phone already raised, finger hovering like she'd been waiting for this moment. Her porch light cast her face in stark contrast. Eyes wide, lips tight, posture rigid with a sense of authority she hadn't earned but fully believed in. "That's not your house," she said loudly, projecting so others could hear. "I've been watching you." A few porch lights flicked on brighter. Doors opened just enough for faces to appear. Elias took a breath, slow, measured. "It is my house," he said calmly. "I live here." Karen let out a short laugh that carried no humor. "I don't think so. I've never seen you before, and I know everyone on this street." That was the first lie she told herself out loud. Elias could feel eyes on him now, not just hers, others, curious, alert, ready to decide. I just moved in, he replied, a few weeks ago. Karen shook her head, already dialing. That's what they always say. She turned slightly away from him, angling the phone toward her face. Yes, hi, I'd like to report a suspicious person. He's trying to break into a home on Willowcrest Drive. Yes, right now. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear, not anger, but something colder, something heavier. Recognition. This wasn't about facts anymore. It was about a story that had already been written. He stepped back from the door, hands visible, body language open. Ma'am, you're making a mistake. Karen's voice grew louder, more animated, as if volume could turn assumption into truth. He's wearing dark clothes, tall, looks like he's been watching houses. I think he's armed. That one landed hard. A murmur rippled through the neighbors. Someone whispered, armed. Elia's jaw tightened. He hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done anything except exist in the wrong body in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that was enough. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens cut through the night. Red and blue lights reflected off windows and car hoods, painting the street in flashes of urgency. Karen lowered her phone and exhaled, a strange mix of relief and triumph crossing her face. She stepped back onto her porch like someone who had just completed an important task. See, she said to no one in particular, this is why we have to be vigilant. Elias stood in the open, the key still in his hand. The front door closed behind him like a boundary he wasn't allowed to cross. 2 patrol cars pulled up fast, doors opened. Officers stepped out with practiced efficiency. Sir, step away from the house, one of them commanded. Elias complied immediately, raising his hands slowly, palms out. I'm the homeowner, he said evenly. My ID is inside. The officers exchanged a glance. One of them looked past Elias to Karen. Ma'am, is this the individual you called about? Karen nodded without hesitation. Yes, that's him. I saw him trying to get in. I didn't feel safe. The words didn't feel safe carried weight. They always did. Sir, the officer said again, his tone firmer now, turn around and place your hands behind your back. Elias hesitated, not in defiance but calculation. Every instinct in him screamed how wrong this was, how dangerous it could become in seconds, but he also knew escalation could cost him more than his pride. Slowly he turned. As the cold metal of the cuffs clicked around his wrists, a hush fell over the street. Phones came out openly now. No one pretended not to stare. From her porch, Karen watched, arms crossed, chin lifted. This was order being restored. This was what she believed safety looked like. Mrs. Carter's door creaked open. She stepped onto her porch, leaning on her cane, eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. She recognized Elias immediately, recognized the stillness in his posture, the restraint in his face. She also recognized the lie unfolding in front of her. That man lives there, she called out, her voice steady but edged with disbelief. I see him every day. The officer glanced at her, then back at Elias. Ma'am, we've got it handled. Mrs. Carter didn't move. You should listen before you decide. Karen scoffed. With all due respect, Evelyn, this isn't your concern. Mrs. Carter turned her gaze toward Karen, something sharp and tired passing between them. It becomes my concern when I see a good man treated like a criminal for unlocking his own door. The officer sighed, irritation creeping in. Ma'am, please go back inside. Elias met Mrs. Carter's eyes for a brief moment. Gratitude flickered there, but so did apology. He hated that she was witnessing this. Sir, the officer said, tugging gently on the cuffs, do you have any weapons on you? No, Elias replied. Any reason you're in this neighborhood? That question cut deeper than the cuffs ever could. I live here, Elias said again. Karen shook her head, whispering loudly to a neighbor, that's what they all say. Elias heard it. He always did. One of the officers stepped closer to Karen. Ma'am, you're saying you saw him attempt a break-in. Yes, she said firmly. I've been watching him for weeks. He doesn't belong here. The phrase hung in the air, heavy with meaning she didn't have to explain. The officer nodded slowly, already forming conclusions. All right, we'll sort it out. As Elias was guided toward the patrol car, his eyes flicked once more toward his front door. The home he had paid for, earned, chosen carefully because it was supposed to be quiet, safe. Temporary. He exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because what looked like the end of the story to Karen Whitmore, the removal of a threat, was only the beginning. And the truth, when it finally arrived, would not ask permission before tearing this neighborhood wide open. The patrol car door closed with a dull, final sound, sealing Elias Monroe inside a space that smelled faintly of vinyl and old disinfectant. The interior light flicked on, washing his face in a pale glow that caught every controlled breath, every muscle held deliberately still. Outside, the neighborhood had fully transformed. What had been a quiet street an hour earlier now felt like a public stage. Neighbors stood in clusters, murmuring behind cupped hands. Some wore concerned expressions. Others looked satisfied, as if order had been restored just in time. Phones were raised openly now, lenses pointed toward the patrol car, hungry for a moment worth sharing. Karen Whitmore descended her porch steps slowly, her movements careful, rehearsed. She approached one of the officers, lowering her voice in a way that suggested intimacy with authority. "I hope you understand," she said, shaking her head. "We've worked really hard to keep this place safe. We can't just ignore red flags." The officer nodded absently, already writing notes. "You did the right thing, ma'am." Those words landed like a quiet verdict. Across the street, Mrs. Carter remained on her porch, her hands gripping the handle of her cane tighter than usual. She watched Elias through the car window, her chest rising with a mixture of anger and helplessness. She had lived long enough to know how quickly moments like this slipped away once the system decided on a direction. She took a step forward. "Officer," she called again, louder this time, "have you checked his address, his ID?" The younger officer hesitated, glancing toward his partner. "Ma'am, please stay back." "I'm not interfering," Mrs. Carter said firmly. "I'm asking a question." Karen turned, irritation flashing across her face. "Evelyn, please, let them do their job." Mrs. Carter's eyes never left the patrol car. "That is what I'm asking them to do." Inside the car, Elias listened without reacting. He knew better than to insert himself right now. He had spent years navigating moments exactly like this, learning when silence protected him and when it endangered him. This moment sat delicately between the two. The officer opened the rear door slightly. "Sir, I'm going to need your full name." "Elias Monroe," he replied without hesitation. "Date of birth?" He answered. "Do you have identification on you?" "It's inside my house. Wallet S on the kitchen counter." The officer closed the door again and walked away, conferring quietly with his partner. Their body language suggested impatience rather than curiosity. Karen folded her arms, watching, convinced the process would validate her instincts. To her, this was no longer about Elias. It was about proving she had been right to trust her fear. Minutes passed. The night air cooled, but the tension did not. A second patrol car pulled up, followed by a third. More uniforms, more eyes. The scene grew heavier, like pressure building under a sealed lid. Mrs. Carter finally stepped off her porch and approached the nearest officer, stopping at a respectful distance. "I've lived here 30 years, she said calmly. "That man hasn't bothered anyone. He fixed my fence last week. He brings in my trash cans. That's not a burglar." The officer sighed, clearly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we appreciate your input, but we have a report of suspicious behavior." "Suspicious to who?" she asked. The question lingered unanswered. Karen shifted her weight, glancing at the growing audience. She could feel something changing. The certainty she had earlier now felt thinner, more brittle. She hadn't expected pushback, not from an old woman, not from the street itself. One officer approached Elias again, opening the door fully this time. "Sir, we're going to check the residence you were entering." Elias nodded. "That's fine." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. This wasn't supposed to take this long. The officer walked to the front door, testing the handle. It opened easily. Inside, the lights revealed a lived-in space, clean, organized, unmistakably occupied. A framed photograph sat on a shelf near the entrance. Elias in uniform, standing beside a group of men and women, all serious, all official. The officer paused. He leaned closer, squinting. He called his partner over. "What is it?" Karen asked sharply, stepping closer. The officer held up a hand, stopping her. He reached for the photograph, studying it more carefully. The insignia on the uniform wasn't local. It wasn't state. It was federal. Back at the patrol car, Elias watched the shift happen in real time. He saw it in the officer's posture, in the sudden straightening of shoulders, in the glance that lingered a second too long on his face. The officer returned, his tone noticeably different. "Sir, you said your name was Elias Monroe." "Yes." "Are you employed by any law enforcement agency?" Elias inhaled slowly. This is the part, he thought, where the story turns. "Yes," he said aloud, "I am." Karen's head snapped toward him. "What?" The officer hesitated. "Can you clarify?" Elias met his eyes through the open door. "I'm a U.S. Marshal." The street fell silent. Not the quiet of calm, but the quiet of disbelief. Karen laughed once sharply. "That's not funny." The officer didn't laugh. He stepped back, radio already in his hand. "Dispatch, I need verification on a federal badge. Name Elias Monroe." Karen felt the ground shift beneath her certainty. "You can't just say that," she protested. "Anyone can say that." Mrs. Carter closed her eyes briefly, exhaling. She had known, not the title, but the truth of the man. Minutes stretched painfully long as confirmation crackled over the radio. Elias remained still, composed, letting the system catch up to what he had known all along. Finally, the radio responded. "Confirmed, active U.S. Marshal, undercover assignment." The words landed like thunder without sound. The officer's entire demeanor changed instantly. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience." Karen staggered back a step, her face draining of color. That doesn't make sense." Elias stepped out of the car as the cuffs were removed, rubbing his wrists slowly. He didn't look at Karen at first. He looked at the house, at the neighbors, at the phones now lowering in uncertain embarrassment. "This neighborhood," he said quietly, finally turning toward her, "is part of a larger investigation." Karen swallowed. "You're saying I called the police on a federal officer?" "You called the police on your neighbor," Elias replied evenly. "Everything else came after." No one spoke. The story the neighborhood had rushed to believe collapsed under its own weight, leaving behind only one undeniable truth. Fear had spoken louder than facts. And now, there was no pretending this moment had never happened. The apology hung in the air, unfinished and inadequate. "I apologize for the inconvenience," the officer had said, as if inconvenience were the right word for what had just unfolded. As if metal cuffs on a man's wrists, fear in his neighbor's eyes, and humiliation broadcast across phone screens could be brushed aside with a procedural phrase. Elias Monroe said nothing. He simply nodded once, a controlled motion that concealed everything he felt. Years of training had taught him how to compartmentalize anger, how to keep his face neutral even when the world tilted unfairly beneath his feet. But this wasn't a fugitive resisting arrest or a hostile interrogation room. This was his home, his street, the place he slept. And now, every set of eyes on Willow Crest Drive was locked onto him with a different kind of curiosity. The officers stepped away from him, suddenly unsure of where to stand. Authority had shifted, and with it, the rules of engagement. Radios crackled with updates. One patrol car quietly pulled off, then another, the lights shutting down as if embarrassed by their own presence. Karen Whitmore stood frozen near the curb. Her arms, once crossed with confidence, now hung stiffly at her sides. She looked smaller somehow, as though the certainty that had animated her body minutes earlier had drained out through her shoes and into the pavement. "I didn't know," she said, her voice brittle. "How could I have known?" Elias finally looked at her. Not with anger, not with triumph, with something far more unsettling, clarity. "You didn't ask," he said calmly. The simplicity of it cut deeper than shouting ever could. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. She searched the faces around her for support, for someone to validate her fear the way they had before. But the neighbors were shifting now, stepping back, avoiding her eyes the same way they had avoided his. Mrs. Carter moved closer to Elias, her presence quiet but grounding. "You all right, son?" she asked softly. Elias nodded. Yes, ma'am. But the truth was more complicated. Because being all right didn't mean untouched. The officers began to disperse, offering clipped nods and half-formed apologies. One lingered, clearly uncomfortable. Sir, if there's anything you need from us. I'll handle it, Elias said. The officer nodded and retreated. The street fell into an awkward silence, broken only by the hum of distant traffic and the shuffling of neighbors unsure whether to stay or go. Some slipped back into their houses quickly, as if proximity to the moment itself might implicate them. Others lingered, curiosity wrestling with shame. Elias turned toward his front door. For the first time that night, he crossed the threshold without obstruction. Inside, the house felt different, smaller, less neutral. The walls that had once offered quiet now echoed with what had happened outside them. He set his bag down carefully, as if grounding himself through routine. Mrs. Carter followed him just inside, pausing respectfully. You don't owe anyone an explanation, she said. Don't let them make you feel like you do. Elias met her eyes. Thank you. Outside, Karen remained rooted to the spot, watching the door close behind him. The victory she had expected had turned into exposure. She had called the police expecting reinforcement. What she got instead was revelation. And now, the weight of it pressed against her chest in a way she wasn't prepared for. She wasn't a villain in her own story. She was a protector. At least that's how she had always framed herself. But protectors weren't supposed to be wrong. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed with quiet aftermath. Group chats lit up with conflicting narratives. Some neighbors expressed shock. Others rushed to justify. A few went silent altogether. Karen typed and deleted messages repeatedly, trying to regain control of a story that no longer belonged to her. Across town, Elias sat at a nondescript desk inside a federal building, briefing his supervisor. The exposure complicates things, the supervisor said, reviewing notes, but it also gives us leverage. Elias nodded. They won't see it coming now. His assignment had always required invisibility. The criminal network they were tracking thrived in places like Willow Crest, places that trusted appearances, that believed crime wore a certain face and lived in certain neighborhoods. Now the mask had slipped. But exposure came with risk. You're sure you want to stay there? The supervisor asked. Elias didn't hesitate. Yes. Because leaving would mean letting the moment define him. And he refused to give fear that kind of power. Back on Willow Crest Drive, Karen hosted an emergency HOA meeting that evening. The room was tense, packed tighter than usual. Faces turned toward her with expectations she could no longer comfortably meet. We need to address what happened, she began, forcing steadiness into her voice. There was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding, someone interrupted. It looked pretty clear to me, another added quietly. Karen's jaw tightened. I was acting in the interest of community safety. Mrs. Carter, seated near the back, raised her hand slowly. The room stilled. Safety for who? She asked. The question rippled outward, unsettling something beneath the surface. Karen faltered, for everyone. Mrs. Carter held her gaze. Then maybe it's time we talk about who gets to feel safe here and who doesn't. No one rushed to Karen's defense this time. Meanwhile, Elias returned home that night aware that every movement he made was now being interpreted through a new lens. Some neighbors offered awkward smiles. Others avoided him entirely. A few nodded with newfound respect that felt just as uncomfortable as the suspicion before it. He remained composed. But inside, something was shifting. He had spent years protecting strangers from the shadows. Now he was forced to confront the truth that even among manicured lawns and polite smiles, injustice could surface just as violently, wrapped not in crime, but in fear. And as the investigation deepened, one thing became increasingly clear. What happened on that street wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom. And before this story reached its end, that truth would demand to be fully exposed, no matter how many people it unsettled along the way. The days that followed did not bring relief. They brought tension wearing a polite smile. Elias felt at the moment he stepped outside each morning, the way conversations stopped mid-sentence, the way doors closed a second too fast, The way eyes lingered just long enough to measure him differently now, not as a threat, but as a complication. Being revealed as a U.S. Marshal hadn't erased suspicion. It had reshaped it. Some neighbors treated him like a quiet hero, nodding with forced admiration as if his badge retroactively made their fear acceptable. Others acted embarrassed, avoiding him entirely, unwilling to confront what their silence had helped enable. And a few, the most dangerous few, felt exposed, watched, defensive. Karen Whitmore was among them. She hadn't slept much since that night. Her mind replayed the scene over and over, the cuffs, the badge, the way the street had gone silent. She told herself she had done nothing wrong. She had followed procedure, trusted her instincts. If anything, the situation proved the system worked. But deep down, something gnawed at her. The HOA group chat had fractured. Messages appeared and disappeared. Some neighbors questioned why police had been called so quickly. Others wondered aloud how many times assumptions like that had been made before, without the benefit of a federal badge to reverse them. Karen tried to steer the conversation back to order. She sent reminders about lawn maintenance, parking violations, noise complaints, control through routine. It didn't work. Meanwhile, Elias continued his assignment with renewed urgency. The exposure had shifted timelines. The criminal network he had been tracking, white-collar fraud hiding behind shell companies and suburban respectability, had gone quiet. Quiet meant nervous. Nervous meant mistakes. He spent nights reviewing files, mapping connections, listening more than he spoke. He noticed patterns now that he hadn't before, who watched him from windows, who suddenly took interest in his schedule, who avoided him entirely. One house 3 doors down caught his attention. Perfect lawn, friendly smiles, excessive friendliness. Too much friendliness was often worse than none. Mrs. Carter noticed it too. "They're watching you," she said one afternoon as they stood near her mailbox. "Not the way they were before. This time, it's calculation." Elias nodded. "I know." She studied him carefully. "You ever think about leaving?" "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I think about what that teaches them." She smiled sadly. That running is easier than changing. That night, the neighborhood experienced its first real rupture. Federal agents arrived quietly, unmarked vehicles blending into the darkness. No sirens, no lights, just doors opening and closing with purpose. 2 houses were searched. 1 resident was taken away in handcuffs, white, well-dressed, respected. The same neighbors who had watched Elias be detained now watched in stunned silence as one of their own was led into a car. No phones came out this time. The whispers the next morning were different. Fear had found a new target. Karen felt it immediately. She replayed the moment she had pointed at Elias and said he doesn't belong here. Now the words echoed back at her from places she didn't expect. Belonging had never been about safety. It had been about comfort. And comfort, she was realizing, had protected the wrong people. At the next HOA meeting, attendance doubled. Elias did not attend. He didn't need to. Mrs. Carter did. She sat in the front row, posture straight, eyes steady. When Karen opened the meeting with forced professionalism, Mrs. Carter waited, let the silence stretch. Then she spoke. "We need to talk about power," she said calmly. Karen stiffened. "This isn't the time for—" "This is exactly the time," Mrs. Carter replied. "Because what happened on this street wasn't an accident, it was a pattern." Murmurs spread. Mrs. Carter continued. "Some of you watched a man get handcuffed for unlocking his own door. Some of you stayed silent. Some of you agreed with it. And the only reason we're uncomfortable now is because the story didn't end the way we expected." Karen felt heat rise to her face. "I acted to protect this community." Mrs. Carter met her gaze. "Then you should ask yourself why the only person you felt threatened by was the one actually protecting it." No one spoke. The meeting ended early, not with resolution, but with reckoning. Karen walked home alone. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, she felt exposed. Not unsafe, but seen. She passed Elias' house and slowed, staring at the porch light glowing softly. For weeks, she had framed that light as suspicious. Now it felt like a mirror. She didn't knock. She wasn't ready. Elias inside reviewed his final report. The investigation was nearing its end. Arrests had been made. Charges prepared. The operation would soon conclude. But something about this place lingered with him. This wasn't just an assignment anymore. It was a lesson unfolding in real time. On his last night before submitting the final evidence, Elias stood on his porch, breathing in the cool air. Mrs. Carter joined him, sitting carefully on a chair he had placed there for her. "You changed this place," she said quietly. Elias shook his head. "I didn't, I just stopped letting it look away." Across the street, Karen watched from her window. For the first time, she didn't see a threat. She saw the weight of her own choices. And she understood, too late but honestly, that fear once unleashed doesn't disappear when proven wrong. It waits. And what mattered now was who would be brave enough to face it when it returned. The final night arrived without ceremony. No sirens, no shouting, no dramatic warning. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in when something decisive is about to happen. Elias Monroe sat alone at his kitchen table, the soft glow of a single light illuminating a stack of neatly arranged folders. Inside them were months of work, financial trails, recorded conversations, timelines that exposed how crime could wear the cleanest clothes and smile the widest smiles. Suburban fraud, identity laundering, money flowing invisibly through shell companies registered to addresses that looked just like his. Just like this neighborhood. Outside, Willow Crest Drive appeared calm, porch lights glowed, lawns slept under darkness, a place convinced it had survived its crisis. It hadn't. Elias checked his watch. Time. He stood, slipped on his jacket, and stepped outside. Across the street, Karen Whitmore was watching from behind her curtains. She told herself it was coincidence, that she just happened to be awake, that she wasn't waiting for something to happen. But she felt it too, that pressure, that sense of inevitability. Ever since the arrests earlier in the week, her world had felt unstable, not unsafe exactly, just uncertain. She had built her identity around vigilance, around being right, around being the one who saw danger before it arrived. Now she wasn't sure she recognized danger at all. When unmarked vehicles rolled quietly onto the street and parked without lights, Karen's breath caught. Her first instinct was to reach for her phone. Her second was to freeze. Men and women stepped out, plain clothes, purposeful movements, no wasted energy. They spread with precision, not urgency, professionals. Elias moved to meet them, nodding once. Mrs. Carter watched from her porch, wrapped in a cardigan, eyes sharp despite the late hour. She had sensed this night coming. She always did. The lead agent spoke softly. "We're ready." Elias nodded. "Let's finish it." The operation unfolded quickly. Doors opened not with force but with warrants. Calm voices replaced raised ones. Confusion replaced confidence. At the third house down, the one Elias had flagged weeks earlier, the truth finally broke through the illusion. A man who hosted barbecues, a woman who chaired fundraisers, respectable, familiar. Handcuffs closed around wrists, no one had ever questioned. Karen watched in disbelief as neighbors she had defended, trusted, even praised, were escorted into vehicles without resistance. There were no accusations shouted, no neighbors filming. Only shame. Only realization. Only silence. One of the arrested men glanced toward Elias as he was led away, eyes narrowing, not with anger but recognition. He understood now who had been watching him all along. And that scared him more than the cuffs. As the vehicles pulled away, Karen stepped outside. She didn't plan to. Her feet moved before her pride could stop them. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. Everyone turned. Elias looked at her calmly. "Why what?" "Why here?" she demanded. "Why this neighborhood?" Elias studied her for a moment, then answered honestly. "Because people hide where they feel safest," he said, "and this place felt untouchable." Karen's chest tightened. "I was trying to protect us." "I know," Elias replied, "but protection without understanding becomes exclusion." The words landed heavily. Karen looked around the street, the same street she had sworn to guard, the same street where she had felt so certain of who belonged and who didn't. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she whispered. Mrs. Carter stepped forward. "Doing the right thing starts with listening," she said gently, "not assuming." Karen's eyes filled, but she didn't look away this time. I hurt you, she said to Elias. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a justification. It was a statement of fact. Yes, Elias replied. The honesty stunned her more than anger would have. I can't undo that, she said. No, he agreed, but you can decide who you are after it. The street felt different now, not healed, not redeemed. But awake. One neighbor spoke up quietly, then another. Questions emerged, not accusations, but reflections. How many times did we let fear decide for us? How many times did we stay silent because it was easier? No one answered right away. Elias didn't need them to. His role here was almost over. As the agents began to leave, the lead agent paused. You handled this with restraint, he said quietly. Most people wouldn't have. Elias looked back at the houses, the porches, the people who would remember this night forever. Restraint is survival, he said. Justice is choice. The agent nodded and left. The street slowly emptied, doors closed, lights dimmed. Karen remained standing, alone now, staring at Elias' house. For the first time, she didn't see a threat. She saw the cost of her certainty. Elias walked back toward his door, then stopped. He turned. This neighborhood will move on, he said, but what happened here shouldn't be forgotten. Karen swallowed. I won't forget. I hope not, he replied. Inside his house, Elias removed his jacket and sat down, exhaustion finally settling into his bones. The mission was complete. The criminals exposed. The operation successful. But this part, the human part, would linger. Across the street, Karen sat on her porch steps, head in her hands, confronting a truth she could no longer outrun. And Mrs. Carter, watching it all, allowed herself a small, weary smile. Because for once, the story hadn't ended with silence. It had ended with truth. And that quiet, uncomfortable, undeniable, was justice. Morning arrived slowly on Willow Crest Drive, as if the neighborhood itself needed time to recover from what it had witnessed. The sunlight touched the houses the same way it always had, soft, forgiving, almost gentle. But nothing felt the same anymore. The street that once prided itself on quiet certainty now carried an unfamiliar weight, awareness. Elias Monroe woke early, as he always did. Habit didn't disappear just because an assignment ended. He brewed his coffee, stood by the window, and watched the street come back to life. Doors opened. Cars pulled out. People waved, hesitant, uncertain waves that didn't know what they meant yet. He didn't wave back immediately. Not out of resentment. Out of honesty. Trust, once fractured, required more than time. It required intention. Across the street, Karen Whitmore sat at her kitchen table, staring into a cup of untouched tea. The night replayed itself in fragments she couldn't silence. The unmarked cars, the arrests, the realization that danger had lived comfortably among people she trusted, while she had turned her fear on the wrong man. She had always believed herself to be observant. Now she wondered how much she had chosen not to see. The HOA inbox was already full. Messages ranged from outrage to embarrassment to quiet questions that had never been asked before. Karen didn't answer them. Not yet. Leadership felt different when certainty was gone. For the first time, she allowed herself to sit with discomfort instead of trying to organize it away. Mrs. Carter stepped onto her porch mid-morning, breathing in the air deeply. She had seen cycles like this before, communities shaken awake, people forced to confront truths they preferred to avoid. Some learned, some hardened. She watched Elias step outside, keys in hand. "Morning," she called gently. "Morning," he replied, walking over. They stood together for a moment, neither rushing to fill the silence. "You leaving today?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Assignment's officially closed." She nodded, absorbing that. "This place won't forget you." Elias gave a small smile. It already has what it needs to remember. As he returned to his house, Karen gathered the courage she had been avoiding. She stepped outside. Her movements were slower than usual, stripped of performance. She crossed the street, stopping a few feet from Elias' porch. He noticed her immediately. "I owe you something," she said. Elias waited. "I owe you an apology," Karen continued. "Not the kind that explains, not the kind that excuses, just an apology." He studied her face. There was no defensiveness left, no authority, just accountability. "All right," he said. "I saw fear and called it protection," she admitted. "I didn't ask who you were, I decided, and I let the system do the rest." Elias nodded. "That's how it usually works." Karen flinched, not at his tone but at the truth in it. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, "but I needed you to know I see it now." Elias considered her words carefully. "Seeing it is the beginning," he said. "What you do next is what matters." She swallowed. "I'm stepping down from the HOA." That surprised him. "I've held power here without understanding responsibility," she continued. "I don't trust myself to lead until I learn how to listen." For the first time, Elias felt something loosen inside his chest. "Then maybe something good came out of this," he said. Karen nodded, tears welling but not falling. She turned and walked back to her house, not redeemed, not resolved, but changed. By noon, the street had mostly returned to routine, but the routines felt altered, softened by reflection. Neighbors who had never spoken to Mrs. Carter stopped to greet her. A few approached Elias, not to congratulate him, but to acknowledge him. Some apologies were awkward. Some were sincere. Some were silent nods filled with regret. Elias accepted them without ceremony. He wasn't there for vindication. He packed his car slowly, deliberately. Every movement felt final. As he closed the trunk, Mrs. Carter approached again, holding a small envelope. "For the road," she said. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you for staying when it would have been easier to leave. You reminded us who courage really belongs to." Elias folded it carefully, placing it in his jacket pocket. As he pulled away, he looked once more at Willow Crest Drive. The lawns were still trimmed, the houses still pristine, but beneath the surface something had shifted. The illusion of innocence was gone. And in its place, if the neighborhood chose to nurture it, was honesty. Weeks passed. Karen kept her promise. The HOA restructured. Meetings opened with listening instead of directives. Policies were reviewed. Language changed, slowly, imperfectly, but intentionally. Mrs. Carter became an informal moral compass, someone people sought out not for permission, but for perspective. And Elias moved on to his next assignment. Different city, different street, same patterns, same risks. But he carried Willow Crest with him, not as a wound, but as proof. Proof that truth could surface even in places built to bury it. Proof that restraint could be more powerful than rage. Proof that justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered, waited, and endured. One evening, months later, Karen received a postcard. No return address. Just a short message. "Keep listening." She smiled softly, setting it down. Because she understood now. The story hadn't been about a burglar. It had been about belonging. About who gets the benefit of doubt. About who bears the weight of fear. And about the quiet strength it takes to stand still long enough for truth to catch up. On Willow Crest Drive, the lights still came on at dusk. But now, when they did, they illuminated something new. Awareness. And that, fragile, uncomfortable, necessary, was the beginning of real safety. This story was never really about a phone call. It wasn't about a neighborhood. It wasn't about a badge. And it definitely wasn't about a man unlocking his own front door. It was about how easily fear disguises itself as responsibility. How quickly assumptions become accusations when we stop seeing people and start seeing stereotypes. How power, when paired with certainty instead of curiosity, can turn ordinary citizens into judges and silence into complicity. Elias Monroe didn't become worthy of dignity because he was a U.S. Marshal. He was worthy of dignity before anyone knew his title. That's the part that matters. Because most people who are misjudged never get the chance to pull out a badge, a title, or proof strong enough to undo the damage. Most never get public apologies. Most never get vindication. They just carry the weight. This story asks a hard question. Who do we believe when fear speaks first? Do we trust systems without questioning how they're used? Do we protect comfort instead of truth? Do we confuse familiarity with safety and difference with danger? Karen didn't wake up intending to harm someone. She believed she was protecting her world. But good intentions don't cancel real harm. Accountability doesn't begin with excuses, it begins with listening. And redemption doesn't come from being right. It comes from being willing to change. Mrs. Carter reminds us of something just as important. Silence is never neutral. Choosing not to speak is still a choice, and it always serves someone. The moral of this story is simple, but not easy. Judge less, ask more. Fear less, listen more. Protect people, not assumptions. Because the next time someone is labeled a threat, they might not be a federal agent. They might just be a neighbor. And if this story made you pause, reflect, or question something you thought you understood, share it with someone who needs that pause too. Sometimes the most powerful justice isn't loud. It's the quiet decision to see each other clearly.